Yeah, there. Yep. Oh. Yeah, now we can. Does it sound like the audio? It sounds like it was coming from just looking at it. Oh no, it is coming. Yeah. We can go ahead and get started. We'll just keep on trying.
Sure. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start the panel. Restrooms are right across the hall. There's a presentation during lunch, but between the panel and the lunch presentation, we stop and get lunch underway down the hall this way. And on page 13 in the back of the booklet are instructions about Wi-Fi. So this panel will be addressing integrated approaches to mental health needs, and will be monitored by Wendy Ward of the Red Cross.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Good morning. When we think of migration, we often think about meeting the immediate physical needs of migrants, unaccompanied children, and refugees. But what about their mental health needs? And this is a critical issue, and I'm really glad that we're going to explore some of its many dimensions this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce this panel of experts who will be tackling it from different angles. So let me start by introducing Marisa Chumil. She is to my left. She's a senior social worker for the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. Prior to joining the Young Center, she worked for 9 years in early childhood programs with a focus on social and emotional childhood development and mental health services for immigrant children and their families. Let me introduce Dr. Janell Routh. She's a pediatrician by training and worked in Malawi for 3 years after joining the Berger International Pediatric AIDS Initiative. Now a medical officer in the Office of Refugee Resettlement, she helps coordinate medical services for the Unaccompanied Children's Program. Next, I'd like to introduce Carl Takei. He is a staff attorney at the National Prison Project of the American Civil Liberties Union. Among many issues, his current advocacy work includes efforts to address the intersection of immigration enforcement with the federal criminal justice system and working to end family detention. And we are working on bringing in our fourth panelist, who I will introduce when she comes on. When we get her up. Actually, let me just go ahead and get her biography right now. Her name is Dr. Jodi Berger Cardoso. She will be joining us by Skype, and she is assistant professor of social work at the University of Houston, currently working on humanitarian organizations, working with them in the Houston area that focus on providing legal and mental health services to immigrants, unaccompanied alien children, and refugees who have experienced trauma. And we'll be working on this, so just have some patience with us. Thank you. So each of our panelists will have 15 minutes to give a presentation, after which we'll have a question and answer period. So Marisa, I'm sorry, do you mind kicking us off?
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity for the Red Cross for convening such a critical event to talk about a really important topic. As part of the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights, I want to talk a little bit about our role with unaccompanied immigrant children. Our work is to promote the best interest of unaccompanied immigrant children. That refers to their safety and their well-being. And we're guided by principles from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we provide child advocates, which are essentially guardian ad litem volunteers for trafficking victims of unaccompanied children. And so as the children are entering the country and apprehended and placed into custody with the Office of Refugee Resettlement, we are appointed by the Department of Health and Human Services to serve as an independent child advocate. And the history of the Young Center, we were actually recently renamed our organization after one of the first children with whom we worked. He was a 14-year-old from China who was a victim of labor trafficking and owed a debt of $60,000. The debt currently for the children coming in from China who are labor trafficked is up to $80,000. But we worked with him while he was in custody and throughout his immigration court proceedings. And recently he was granted citizenship as attending a university in Texas. He graciously lent his name to our organization. I think his story points to the significance of the role of an advocate. To follow children through their journey in detention upon release and into integration in the community. So we're advocating for an immigration system that is just for children, so that all decision makers are considering best interests when making decisions about custody, about removal proceedings, about reunification, about safe repatriation. As it stands now, children are held to the same evidentiary procedural requirements. There's no specific judges for children and no attorneys at government expense, and children present their cases similar to how adults do. We currently have offices in 5 locations in Chicago, Houston, Harlingen, New York, and DC. And we will be expanding to Phoenix, San Antonio, and Los Angeles. And so the importance of our growth and expansion, I think, signifies that there's so much need recognized for children as they're integrating into communities, especially children with trauma histories. And so our role as child advocate is pursuant to the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act to serve as child advocates and advocate for best interests. And we look to international law, we look to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because there is no best interest standard for children in immigration law. We look to the laws of the states in which the children are living and advocating that best interest be a primary consideration when decisions are made. And our role of advocates is to accompany them, to be present with them, to partner with them, to connect them to service providers throughout their journey. And we are similar to a court-appointed special advocate model in which we have volunteers who we train to meet independently with the children and to learn their stories. And so we view the child holistically. We view and recognize the impact of their traumas. We're attuned to both the legal and non-legal issues that they're facing. And our paradigm for best interest is based on the child's wishes, their expressed wishes in accordance with their age and their maturity, and to empower them in this process to be able to voice their wishes. But we're also looking at safety and recognize that safety needs to be a very critical portion when making best interest determinations. We also look to the right to be with family, to be with their parents and their siblings, the right to be free from detention, and their right to medical and mental health care and other basic developmental needs. And so as we're learning their story and advocating with stakeholders, with immigration judges, with ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, we're presenting their stories and our best interest analysis. And so I just want to highlight one of the children that we worked with was 14 and came from Nigeria. And he was at soccer practice. Unfortunately, his family was killed in a church bombing. And so he fled for safety and actually was a stowaway on a ship. And when he arrived in the U.S., we worked with him. We were appointed to work with him as he was in custody. Unfortunately, he was able to be placed into long-term foster care eventually, but there were concerns about his story and what was his story, and helping him remember all the details that, as an impact of trauma, he was not able to remember. And so fortunately, we were able to advocate for a pro bono mental health evaluation to put some of the trauma into perspective, to recognize the impact of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and how that would impact how he's telling his story to pursue legal relief. Unfortunately, he was granted legal permanent residence and was looking to attend college very soon. And so we recognize as part of their journey, so many children are fleeing, and before they even leave their home countries, they are impacted by trauma in the homes, trauma in the community. The UN report, Children on the Run, that came out in 2014, stated that nearly 60% of children were forcibly displaced and were in need of international protection. So we're seeing those children who are working demonstrate symptoms of trauma. And we also recognize that it can be a very conflicted situation to leave their family, to leave all that they know, to leave all that behind, to be separated from their culture and from their family. And so as they're then on a journey, they could be re-traumatized or could face new traumas. Many of the children with whom we're working are re-trafficked during their journey. And some may come with an expectation to reunify with family members, and as they are apprehended and placed into custody, it's something unexpected. It's a disruption to their journey. And so sometimes children struggle with that environment and can be another form of trauma for them. And the facility staff care very deeply about these children. They're helping them access educational and recreational resources, medical care, mental health care. And we recognize that some children need a specialized plan for care. Some children have highly sensitive needs based on trauma history, based on mental health services, and children in custody can access those services, but there certainly is an increased need for those services, and some of those services are community-based needs for psychological evaluations or treatment at inpatient locations. And as a child advocate that is working with the child throughout their time in custody, we continue to work with them after they are released from custody and help them as they're transitioning to be with their family, to integrate into community. We believe that they continue to remain vulnerable throughout the course of their immigration court proceedings and want to advocate for their safety and ensure that they have an attorney to accompany them to court. And oftentimes we present best interest recommendations to immigration judges, to asylum officers, and to their attorneys. And we certainly are working with them to integrate and connect to local service providers in their communities, helping their family members connect to those services as they are coming out of custody and enrolling into school and being able to recover from some of the trauma that they have endured. And so our call to action is really a need for immigrant children to have more access to services, especially in the community, that are trauma informed, to increase our collaboration across disciplines, to share expertise. At the Young Center, we're staff members are social workers and attorneys, and we really come to the table with both perspectives and see that there is a need to fill in some of these service area gaps for children to access mental health services and to access pro bono attorneys. We see some concerns raised by attorneys being that the children who are trying to tell their story as part of their legal case may not remember details, may not be able to tell their story in a linear chronological way. And so having those mental health evaluators and services available, even as the children are pursuing legal cases, is of utmost importance. And the other call to action, I believe, is that in the service providers and in those families who are helping the children integrate, it's important to recognize the impact of vicarious trauma and secondary trauma, and to have services even available for the providers and the family members, and to be mindful of self-care and self-care practices. And so thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to working with all of the community partners to meet this increased need.
Thank you so much, Marisa. Dr. Routh, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me speak today. It was great actually meeting Marisa for the first time and listening to her speak. I work on the medical team with the Office of Refugee Resettlement, specifically for the Unaccompanied Children's Program. And so from the time they enter custody to the time they're reunified with a sponsor, they're in my care for all of their medical and mental health needs. We do obviously contract with a variety of public and private providers out in the cities where these children are housed, which is nationwide all across the country. But it's been nice listening to Marisa talk about some of these services that they're able to access both in the programs and then once they're released. I very much focus on the medical aspect of things, and so it's really great to know that these services are able to continue once they're released from our custody. I wanted to talk a little bit today just about who these children are, where they come from, and what they present with when they arrive into our care, and a little bit about the types of services that we do offer to them while they're in our custody until they're released. So, one thing that was a bit of a misconception to me when I first started the job, I've only been working there for about 7 months. So this is all still a little bit new to me, is that these children are not refugees. And I was struck by your question in the keynote session. That language really helps us define who these children are. These children are fleeing violence, they're fleeing gang violence, they're fleeing sexual violence in their home countries, but yet they're not considered refugees when they come to this country. They're considered immigrants and undocumented immigrants. And I think hopefully we can start to work on changing a little bit of that language and therefore changing their status. Because as refugees, they are afforded certain rights and services once they enter the United States. These children have nothing. So when they leave OR custody, when they are reunited with a sponsor, they're basically dependent on whatever that sponsor can provide or whatever state services are available. But there's nothing that the federal government then goes on to provide for them. We see in our program mostly children from Central America. As you know, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador are the 3 countries that comprise most of our population. We do see about 5% from other countries, such as countries in West Africa and the Indian subcontinent, but we do focus mostly on children from Central America. Last year, we cared for over 35,000 unaccompanied children in our program, and we're trying to decide what to expect this year. As you know, 2014 was certainly a striking year for unaccompanied children. Over 56,000 came into custody that year. So last year was a little bit less. We can talk certainly about reasons why. But I think this year we are potentially predicting another surge of children to come across this summer. Like I said, these children, almost all of them have experienced some form of trauma, either in their country of origin or during the journey to the United States. This, is then compounded by being in a new situation here in the United States, a program with different rules, trying to adjust to a new culture, and then what struck me in particular is being released to a family who they never grew up with. So oftentimes their sponsors are parents, but parents who they haven't seen in almost their entire lifetime, or a family relative, or occasionally family friends will also apply to be sponsors for these children. So they're going into situations where they just really don't have any expectations or know what to expect. While they're in our custody, we do provide them with a complete medical examination and all of their appropriate immunizations, so that when they are released into the care of a sponsor, they're able to go to school. So not only do the immunizations provide protection, obviously, from certain infectious illnesses, but they also do cover that child so they can begin school right away. They're assessed for mental health needs, and I like the fact that our program has set this up so those needs are assessed on an ongoing basis. I think, it's very scary for a child to come in and be asked questions either by a social worker or by a physician, and it takes time for them to adjust to their new situation. So these children are assessed on a weekly basis. They have a one-on-one counseling session every week with the same licensed social worker. So they grow to become familiar with the social worker, and we definitely notice children who are in our custody more long-term start to open up about traumatic events that may have occurred either in their country or on the journey. They also have group counseling sessions twice a week. So with other unaccompanied children, these sessions are either educational or therapeutic. They are also assessed when they first arrive for any trafficking issues that may have taken place. And if that is determined, they are immediately given special services around that issue. So if a child is identified with psychological or mental health needs, they immediately are then given two things. One is a behavioral psychological evaluation, and another is an appointment with a psychiatrist. Usually these are providers out in the community, and we have significant challenges here. As you can imagine, most of these children are Spanish speaking, or many speak local Mayan dialects. And so we actually have difficulty finding providers and translators that are able to meet these needs. But we do try to get those types of evaluations done as soon as possible. And I was struck by something the keynote speaker said. It's not always just about counseling. Some of these children do require medications to help them deal with the trauma that's taken place. We see a huge spectrum of illness. PTSD, obviously, depression, anxiety disorders. And I've been struck by the number of children who report visual and auditory hallucinations. We know that teenage years can be the years that schizophrenia first manifests. But at the same time, I wonder if there is a cultural component to some of these hallucinations that that I just don't have the experience to understand. But it is very curious to me how many children we do see in our programs that report these types of things. So most children, we try to work with community psychiatrists and psychologists to provide medication and counseling. If children require more intensive services, we do have 2 residential treatment centers where children can be placed for more intensive oversight and therapy. We have about 40 to 45 children at any given time in these treatment facilities. And I was able, I thought it might be interesting just to give you some idea of the scope of mental health issues in our program. As I mentioned, and so these numbers, please take with a grain of salt. We are trying to develop a surveillance system so we can more adequately capture the medical and mental issues that we see in our UC population. But until now, the only data we really have is through billing and through insurance issues. So we work with a really wonderful insurance underwriter, and I had them pull some numbers just to kind of give you a perspective on what we see. So as I mentioned, we saw last year about 35,000 children, and within that population, we had over the course of the year about 128 inpatient admissions for anything from suicidal ideation to severe depression to schizophrenia. And we had about 120, like a 72-hour psychiatric hold. So a child would go into the hospital with suicidal ideation, and through counseling there, determine not to be a danger to self and then release back to our program. So you can see it does actually represent a very small percentage of the vast number of children that we did treat last year. Within that group, we provided about 700 outpatient psychiatric and psychological consultations, and we have about 300 children currently that are undergoing like a sort of regular intensive counseling with a behavioral counselor. So again, it represents a significant amount, but when you look at the overall population, a very small percentage. That said, I feel like these are the numbers that come to our attention, and I suspect there are a vast number of children that never tell us about the trauma that took place. Children are in our custody for an average of 28 days, and so in that span of time, it's often not enough to really understand the stories and understand the issues that these children had or have. So, thankfully, we have Marisa and post-release services for some of these children to be able to continuously work with them and the trauma that they've faced. I did want to mention quickly about post-release services. So any child who has come to our attention in terms of needing mental health care does qualify for post-release services. And what takes place is that as the child gets ready to be released to a sponsor, they are placed on a list to receive these services. These services must be enacted within 48 hours of the release of the child to the sponsor. So we have to make sure up front that those services are available. We have a long wait list for these services, and so children can wait up to 2 months in our custody until we can actually arrange for post-release services to access the child within 48 hours. This waiting period can compound depression and anxiety for children, and so sometimes it turns out to be a very vicious cycle. Last year, about 10% of our unaccompanied children's population, or roughly 8,000, qualified for post-release services. And I think my time is about up, so I will just say, I'll pass it on to Carl, and I'm happy to take questions about our program later on.
Thank you, Dr. Routh. Carl.
Thanks. And so I work for the ACLU's National Prison Project, and my focus is on places of detention. And for a long time, the detention of children and families is not something that we engaged in on anything more than a very, very small scale. After the during the Bush administration, there was the Hutto Detention Center, which was an early experiment with family detention. After an ACLU lawsuit and tons of advocacy work, that was converted into an adult detention facility. From that point until 2014, there were fewer than 100 family detention beds in the United States. Since 2014, though, with the large increases in the number of children and families coming from the Northern Triangle to the United States, the government response has been to massively ramp up family detention. There are now nearly 4,000 family detention beds in the United States, and this is the largest project of locking up families with children since World War II. And although the populations are quite different in some ways, from the World War II Japanese American incarceration, there are strong similarities in the harms that this detention causes. And that's why I'm going to start with some context from World War II. I should also say my own family was incarcerated during World War II, so I'm a fourth generation Japanese American. Yeah, let's see. So can you move to the next photo? This is, there were a whole range of ages of children, ranging from babies to school children to teenagers, and living with their families in a strongly carceral environment with military guards, surrounded by barbed wire, and where the family structure was undermined by this carceral environment. Parents were unable to exercise authority over their children because the guards were the ultimate authorities, and there were all kinds of structures inside the camps that helped to undermine parental authority and undermine the bond between parents and their children. There was a study done by Gwendolyn Jensen in 1998 that examined the consequences of this for both parents and children. Jensen found that during the World War II incarceration, the suicide rate inside the camps was double the national average, and that the long-term health consequences included post-traumatic stress symptoms, which were particularly prevalent among the people who were children at the time, and that former incarcerees had more than double the risk of cardiovascular disease compared to non-incarcerated counterparts in Hawaii. Can you move to the next slide? Now, actually, can you move to the next one now? Moving on to 2014 and the present, the children and families coming from northern tribal countries are a group that has, as we've discussed, tremendous amounts of pre-existing trauma. They're escaping death threats, rape, forced gang recruitment, domestic violence, and their first encounter with U.S. authorities is being apprehended by Border Patrol and being placed in a Customs and Border Protection, officially called a hold room, within the immigrant community and the advocacy community. They're known as hileras, or ice boxes. Next slide. And the hileras are, these are jail environments. They're often kept at a temperature that, for people who have just made a desert crossing, is very, very cold. And the floors are concrete. The benches inside are either metal or concrete. So people tell stories of coming through these hileras and just shivering and shivering and shivering for days while they are waiting to be processed. If you're an unaccompanied child in an hilera, then you end up getting turned over to the custody of ORR. And so that's what we've been talking about so far. However, if you're a child who has arrived with your parent, particularly if you arrive with your mother, then this whole other system kicks in, and it's the system run by ICE instead of by ORR. Next slide. This is Dili, which is the flagship of ICE's family detention system, and it was constructed in 2014 by the private prison company Corrections Corporation of America. And you can see that although there are these sort of summer camp-like tropes, the different housing units are called red parrot, green turtle, brown bear, blue butterfly. It is in fact a detention facility with a carceral environment. It's surrounded by high walls designed to be difficult to scale. There are security cameras. There are regular bed checks during the day. children are required to be counted by the guards. So when I went there in May of 2015 to see the facility and interview detainees, one of the stories that I heard was that during a morning count, everybody was required to remain inside their housing units, and a little girl had to go use the bathroom, but the bathrooms are separated from the housing units, and she ended up peeing in her pants because the guards wouldn't let her out. There are many detainees who are very young. Next slide. Some are even babies. Next slide. And if you look at the shoe size here, this is, I think, one of the most depressing aspects, and one that, ironically, the officials leading the tour were quite proud of the fact that these tiny, tiny shoes that they supply to detainees upon intake have shoelaces because the shoelaces allow them to develop important life skills. The problem, however, is that all of this is happening inside a fence. Next slide. Recreational activities, school, everything is set up to reinforce to children that they are jailed. And one mother has said, this is a gilded cage, but it is still a cage. There are many, many mothers who have described the pain of having their children ask them, "Mommy, why are we in jail?" and not being able to answer the question. And this, again, replicates the same sort of breakdown of the parent-child relationship that was documented in World War II, because both the parent and child are subject to the authority of the guards. Another aspect, next slide, is, sorry, this is the school, which is, each of those doors is a classroom in the school because there are 2,400 people inside this detention facility, which require, and many of them are school-age children. Next slide. Another aspect is the setup of the housing units. So this is the interior of one of the housing units, and you can see there are these, this is sort of a common area in here, and then there are rows of a total of 6 bunks, 3 on each side. These can be occupied by unrelated families, so you're housing people who have no connection to each other together from different families. The only privacy is provided by the curtain over there that you can sort of wrap yourself in the curtain while you're changing. So, you know, this limited privacy also has harms and creates new traumas. This has physical manifestations. For example, a 9-year-old who had fled from El Salvador with her mother and her sister after her father was kidnapped, engaged in nighttime bedwetting, crying herself to sleep, had a lack of appetite, agitation, emotional volatility, and even though she was seen by a psychologist at the family detention facility, her emotional state continued to deteriorate. And these complaints are widespread across the family detention facilities. There are many reports of children refusing to eat the food that's provided to them, which results in significant weight loss. They have symptoms of depression, anxiety, and you know, this is a combination of the pre-existing trauma that these children and mothers came in with and the added trauma of detention. There are alarming signs that the medical contractors even are not taking these issues of trauma as seriously as they should be. When I visited Dili in May, the medical staff person who led our tour of the medical unit told us that they were the women were generally seeking less treatment for PTSD than he expected. He attributed this to their resilience, and that the evidence of their resilience is that they were able to go through great hardships to make their journeys to the United States. Well, it may be true that the ability to engage in these very dangerous, treacherous crossings is evidence of resilience. That completely fails to take into account what Harold Brooks said this morning, that even if somebody has resilience to begin with, we should be trying to enhance that resilience. Next slide. Now, of course, CCA and ICE explicitly reject any comparisons to the World War II incarceration camps. I just leave it to you to judge for yourself. Next slide. This is the interior of a reconstructed barracks at Manzanar, one of the World War II incarceration camps that I took at a recent visit. And just think back to the slide that I gave earlier about the inside of the daily housing unit.
Thank you so much, Carl. Dr. Berger Cardoso.
She's on the line.
Okay, great.
She's on the phone.
Yes, I am. I'm here.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
Morning,
Thank you
everyone.
so much for joining us. We're all here, and we're ready to go if you are.
Do you want to try the camera, or should we not risk it?
I think we've tried the camera quite a few times. We're trying it one more time. Let's just see what happens. Thanks for your patience, by the way.
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, Dr. Berger Cardoso, it's not working right now, so we'll have you next to the mic. Can everyone in the room hear okay? Okay, great. That's great. So feel free to go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, hi, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person, but I'm happy to be part of this call. Thank you, Nadia, for inviting me. I am here to talk about addressing the complex needs of youth in the community, and I'll give a little bit of background, and then I'll highlight some of the things that we've been doing on the ground here in Houston, and sort of talk about some of the things that I'd like to see happen more holistically. I started about 3 or 4 years ago, I started doing pro bono mental health evaluations for organizations like the University of Houston Law Clinic, the Young Center, Human Rights First, Kind, Takei Justice Center, because there was a lack of mental health professionals that focus on trauma and migration that were equipped to evaluate children for asylum and SIJ cases. So I started getting involved in the community from that angle, and these things have sort of evolved from that work. As you guys, I'm sure, as Janell had mentioned, and between 2014 and 2015 fiscal years, the Office of Refugee and Resettlement placed around 77,000 unaccompanied children with a parent or an adult sponsor in the United States. Approximately 10,178 children were released in Texas, with Harris County, the largest county, being the largest receiver of children. So where the University of Houston is, that we receive the largest number of unaccompanied children from ORR shelters. Just to give you sort of a framework, I asked the Houston Independent School District to support some numbers, and in 2013-2014 academic school year, there were 663 first-year children or first-year immigrants from El Salvador. But in 2014-2015, there were 1,284. So for El Salvador alone, we doubled the number of kids just in 1 year. And when we look at Honduras, it's even more drastic. In 2013-2014, there were 496 youth who arrived to the Houston area and were receiving services in schools. But in 2014, 2015, there were 1,385. That's more than 2.8 times what it was the year before. And the reason that I point this out is because when we think about how the communities respond to the needs of children, in particular the needs of a very vulnerable group, it's really important to understand the complexity, but also the magnitude of the kids in the Houston Independent School District. When you look at all of the surrounding school districts like Spring Branch and Pasadena, we have, 300 and 400 children from the Northern Triangle who were registered for school in the 2014-2015 year. So we really are seeing this, flux of children in the school, and we're really working with the school districts to try and figure out the best way to service these children. But there are very significant challenges, some of which have been mentioned. Some of the community challenges that we face are, as Janell mentioned, only about 10% of children that exit Office of Refugee and Resettlement Care receive post-release services. So there's an overall limited knowledge about the health, legal, family, and educational context of these children post-release. And this is especially true for children who are not connected to legal services or to post-release services. And this is really problematic for some of the information that I was hearing come from Janell with respect to mental health diagnoses, because we know a large percentage of children present with delayed expression for post-traumatic stress disorder and for other depressive and psychotic disorders. And we know that psychotic disorders can sometimes look, or post-traumatic stress disorder can sometimes look like psychotic disorders when we have a lot of, sort of revisiting of the trauma, images in the head. And when kids have experienced trauma, their ability to articulate sometimes that trauma, especially if that trauma has been chronic, is really limited. And so when we see kids sort of released into the community, even if they haven't been identified in the context of the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, we're seeing a large number of kids present with pretty high symptomology in the schools, such to the degree that the schools are really challenged with educating the kids, because the kids can't really integrate their sort of the stress, the pre-migration stress and the post-migration stress that they are encountering. Social service and legal providers are challenged with coordinating these services, and this is often a very fragmented process. So, for example, when a child is released and is in the community, if they may qualify for some sort of immigration relief, they may be contacted, or they may be followed by an attorney. But the attorney isn't trained to identify trauma and isn't really trained to understand the impact of trauma on child development. So one of the things that I have been doing a lot in the Houston community is giving a lot of sort of pro bono talks at legal service provider meetings where we discuss what trauma looks like, what the trauma memory looks like. So why can't a kid understand the details of their traumatic events in a chronological order? Why do they leave certain things out? Why do sometimes they mention it this way and other times they mention it another way? And then talking about sort of vicarious trauma with the legal service providers who are really not trained to understand not only the impact of trauma on child development, but the impact of these stories and how they'll manifest with the attorneys themselves. So sort of the mental health service provision and the school provision and the legal service provision, these services are often very fragmented, and there isn't a whole lot of coordination of services. And then other community challenges that we've observed are interactions with the Child Protective Service agencies here, and the increased risk for child maltreatment. We see this, many kids who have never lived with a parent or are being reunified with a parent after 4 and 5 and 6 years. That reunification, might have this grace period initially where things are really well, but after 3 to 4 months of the child living in the home, we see a lot of family challenges, both with the child not really understanding the authority of the parent and the parent really not understanding the needs of the child. And in some cases where children are, at risk for maltreatment, we run a lot of challenges with the Child Protective Service agencies wanting to take jurisdiction over immigrant children, often indicating that the jurisdiction belongs in the hands of the federal government or ORR, which we know to be not the case because ORR doesn't have jurisdiction over kids once they're released. So there's this real sort of misunderstanding when there are issues of child maltreatment that have been identified as to who could potentially take custody of the children. And another huge challenge we're seeing here on the ground is, many of you know Houston is the second largest site for human trafficking in the country. Sometimes we're first, sometimes we're second to Atlanta. And we're seeing a lot of children, particularly those who are not placed with parents, but even some of those who are, but have placement disruptions or placements that break down. We're seeing them at a risk for both sex trafficking and, migrant trafficking for work. We see a lot of
Looks like we lost some power.
Okay.
Yeah, on the phone, so I would call her back.
No. Sorry about that.
No.
Let's see this.
Sorry about that. Thanks for your patience.
You back?
I'm back.
Actually, we have you better now than ever.
Okay, can you tell me where I left off?
Yes, the fragmented services and then CPS involvement. Oh yeah, human trafficking.
Atlanta and Houston.
Atlanta and
Okay.
Houston.
So kids are often at risk for human trafficking, and Houston being the second largest site for human trafficking in the country, we have very well-defined and very well-oiled trafficking rings here, and that has led to issues of child protection once kids are in the community. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the on-the-ground things that we've been doing in the community. They've sort of been evolved from the needs that social service and legal organizations have identified. So in 2014, during the surge, we formed a couple of working groups in the city. One in particular that I'm a big part of is the Central American Children's Work Group, which consists of legal service providers from Kids in Need of Defense, the Young Center, Tahare, all of the players, human rights that I've mentioned. And it also includes other social service organizations that provide post-release services like the YMCA, Refugee Services of Texas. It also includes organizations like DePelchin and all of the school districts that are interacting with unaccompanied children. So we meet once a month to discuss sort of what are the primary and principal needs of unaccompanied children and how might we work together to meet these needs in an environment where we have access to very little funding. I just want to sort of put it out there. Texas itself is ranked 49th in the nation for mental health service provision for citizen children. So you can imagine sort of the challenges to providing services reimbursement. So early this year, we sent out a survey to all of the social service and legal providers, or most of them in the Houston area, and we asked them to identify the top needs of unaccompanied children in the community. And they identified 4 top needs: unmet health and mental health needs, placement disruption or homelessness, school and academic challenges, and legal needs. So I'm going to highlight some of the programs that have sort of slowly evolved from identifying some of these needs or were in place before we identified these needs. There's the Houston Immigration Legal Services Collaborative, which is a series of nonprofit legal providers like Catholic Charities, the Young Center, Kind, Human Rights First, and Takei. And they receive major funding from the Houston Endowment, and they provide pro bono legal services to unaccompanied kids and children who have experienced trafficking. And so we have tried, the Central American Minors Work Group have tried to coordinate with the Houston Immigration Legal Services Collaborative to sort of have a holistic conversation about legal and health needs of kids. Refugee Services of Texas recently started an unaccompanied minors youth mentoring program where they screen volunteers, and these volunteers can provide mentorship to unaccompanied kids from, how do you, how do you get access to clothing, or how do you take the bus, or how do you make it through a day in school. So they're sort of layman volunteers, but are mentoring unaccompanied minors who are.
Jodi, are you there?
In the community.
There you go.
We saw, are you there?
Yes.
Okay. Initially, when we saw kids in the community, the Houston Interfaith Disaster Response Alliance came together and had a fundraiser and created a fund called Hydra, which was established to pay mental health professionals to evaluate kids, also to pay court fees and clothing. The challenges that we're seeing now is that kids are not so much in the media, we're having challenges in reestablishing or fundraising for those funds. And then most recently, and probably have the potential for the most impact, is the Children's Center, which is a nonprofit organization in Brazoria County and Galveston County, is opening up a crisis response center as of April 1st, 2016, that will respond to children, youth, and family issues concerning abuse, neglect, abandonment, and runaway and homeless status, and for kids at risk of human trafficking. So it will be a mobile bilingual crisis response team. And they are working to develop a network of volunteer host homes and foster homes or respite care for unaccompanied children who may be at risk for placement disruption or may be homeless. And this team directly sort of evolved from the Central American Children's Work Group in relation to trying to identify more concrete services for children who may have placement disruptions or experience homelessness or re-victimization. So some next steps that I kind of see is I think it's going to be critical, really critical, to see greater collaboration between the Office of Refugee and Resettlement and receiving communities to improve coordination of care. So it would be great if the social service organizations around town could work with ORR to sort of identify kids who may be at risk and then offer more wraparound services to these youth, something that ORR is just challenged with the number of kids they have compared to the number of kids that they can support through post-release services. So I really see that as an enormous way of increasing oversight for kids in the community, is improving coordination and collaboration. Also increasing research efforts to better understand the needs of youth in the community and to identify best practices to promote resilience. So I have a very small study currently funded by the Center for Mexican American Studies, where I am interviewing kids, unaccompanied kids, about how they cope with the stressors of their experiences in their home country, but mostly how they cope with the stress of life in the United States, and sort of understanding what's going on and how kids are coping. We hear anecdotally a lot about sort of self-coping with substance use and alcohol. And that came out of a report by the Catholic bishops all the way back in 2012, where kids who had experienced really high doses of trauma and were untreated were turning to substances to cope with their trauma symptoms. So really understanding how kids are coping and improving how we provide services to these kids is going to be really critical. And also, there has been some movement in the Los Angeles Unified School District through their mental health services team about providing cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, the CBIT intervention for unaccompanied kids who are in the LA Unified School District. And we've been sort of working to see how we might adapt that methodology to providing some kind of treatment or services to kids in schools. And that sort of leads to my last step of sort of increasing the delivery of mental health services and legal and educational services to youth. And one way to do that is really to rethink how we classify or characterize kids in terms of their documentation status versus whether or not these kids are indeed refugees, which might open the capacity for them to receive very much needed services post-release. So that's kind of what we've been doing and my perception of our major next steps here at the community level.
Thank you, Jodi. Thank you for your contribution.
Yes, thanks so much, and thanks again for your patience. So
Nadia?
Yes. Can you hear Wendy?
I cannot hear Wendy.
Okay.
But I can hear you and I'm done.
Okay. We got you. And right now, I think Wendy's switching over to the question and answer session.
yes, absolutely. It would be great to take some questions from the audience if you have any. That would be wonderful. Yeah, I know.
So she could be there, but also here? Is that possible?
It's not my phone. It's the computer.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So can we call like her cell? Because she's on the Skype number, right? So
Yeah.
can we call the cell number?
Can we call you on your cell phone, Jodi?
On my cell phone?
Yes.
Yeah, actually, can you call me on my office phone?
Sure.
It's 713
Yes.
743 1157.
Got it.
Okay, bye.
Hi there. Great, we can hear you. Can everyone hear her? Wonderful, thanks again. So to kick off the Q&A, I just have a question. Dr. Berger Cardoso talked about collaboration, research, coordination being essential regarding the integration of unaccompanied children into communities. What other low-cost resources are out there that we can consider that could help foster resilience? That is sort of the overarching theme. I know that they're touched on a lot of different pieces and they're moving. And I'm trying to think of a way to kind of unify that with like the post-release services being more robust potentially. Are there other ways? Please, Dr. Routh.
Well, I think Jodi, Dr. Berger Cardoso, mentioned something, and I think I've seen it work globally, certainly in African countries that don't have a lot of resources. Peer-to-peer mentoring is huge. Through peer-to-peer mentoring programs, my previous work was in pediatric HIV. We were very much able to have families of children who were already on medications speak to those who weren't. We had mothers who were previously HIV tested speak to those who weren't, and through those peer-to-peer relationships, I think help build understanding and adherence and resilience for that type of thing. So Jodi mentioned that there is a peer-to-peer mentorship program happening for UC, And that just rang a bell with me. I thought that is a wonderful, very low resource way to help children integrate into the community.
Great, thank you so much. Marisa?
Sure. One other idea is that in Chicago, where I'm stationed, the Illinois Childhood Trauma Coalition is surveying existing systems of service providers for children and youth who have undergone trauma, and looking to train those service providers in the issues related to migrant children and refugee children. And so having a cross-training between what we know exists for children in our states already to expanding part of their understanding of what is different about a migrant child or refugee child and the specific trauma needs that they may have, so cross systems.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an area that's a little outside of my expertise. Yeah. But for the families who are coming out of detention, there is a huge need because many of them do get released on bond or get relief in their immigration cases, and so.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Questions from the audience? Thank you, Nadia.
So I hear the examples from Houston and Chicago, but it sounds like there's actually an initiative on behalf of organizations to engage and then do these types of evaluations and needs assessments and then identify how they can work together. That seems very specific to Chicago and Houston. And so, I just wondering how this can be duplicated, and especially when there are sometimes people who are, who are sponsored by families who are in rural areas as well. And so how to engage in those areas and also how to highlight these best practices, which really that's what it is in Chicago and Houston, to share amongst the community, and how can ORR facilitate that sharing of best practices so that it is resource effective and efficient and can support the system which is under resourced.
Hi, this is Jodi. I want to respond just briefly to the question. I think what we're doing, at least in Houston, is responding to an emergency, right? But there isn't a whole lot of knowledge about best practices. The Central American Migrants Work Group, we are a bunch of social service volunteers, essentially. Like, we work for social service organizations that will allow us to meet one day a month. But there isn't a whole lot of coordination up here, and we don't have a lot of evidence to support best practices. And that, I think, is really something that is a critical next step. Hopefully that could partially be facilitated by ORR, but also among community organizations doing similar work. I think we have to think very strategically how to evaluate the best way to service kids, because kids that are this vulnerable, we don't want to unintentionally do more harm than good.
Thank you so much for that. Other comments?
I would say two things. So I would say two things about your comment, Nadia, which is a good one. One is just a comment, which is I was struck the other day. I met one of our monitoring team members in the hallway, and he had just been out to a program. OR has a policy of making a 30-day phone call. So the program where the child was housed until they are reunited makes a 30-day phone call to that family just to see how things are going 1 month after the reunification has taken place. And so he was talking to the program about these phone calls, and he was struck by the number of children who were asking to come back into OR custody. And I think I just stood there with my mouth open. I never expected that. And he said, particularly in the rural communities where they may be one of very few Latino families in the area. They get bullied at school. the supermarkets don't carry food that they like to eat. And at least in OR custody, there was a rhythm, a routine. So yes, I think to your question, we certainly need to do more. And one thing I would point out in terms of ORR being able to provide those kinds of services or best practice, like to be able to gather best practices. The number of unaccompanied children who has been coming across the border has been doubling every year since 2010. But the program itself has been incredibly small up until the year of the surge, when I think it really hit people in the face that this was an issue that was not going away. So ORR last year actually just received funding to put together the team that I work on. So all 7 of us who have joined the team have just arrived in the past year. And so hopefully now that people are recognizing this is going to be an issue that the US will be dealing with for some time, I'm hoping that we'll get more help to create not just a medical team, a surveillance team, but also a team that can address the needs of children once they're released.
Thank you so much. Other comments? Marisa?
I just want to say, the kids that are requesting to go back into ORR custody, I think that that's a real big issue, and that speaks to the need to really understand placement disruption and the number of kids who are placed post ORR whose initial placement does not work, and children are, trying to find a different placement themselves. That was one of the emphases for us joining it as social service providers, is that several of us were picking up, these children homeless. And so I think that really trying to know what happens to these kids is an issue of child protection that we need to address at the community level, but also at the federal level.
Thank you.
Marisa, did you have? Sure. One other, to respond to the question about duplicating these models in communities, one thing I think that's been helpful is partnering with universities who often have resources and have individuals with time and interest to become learners of this new population and to become service providers, so that up and coming professionals come with this knowledge and with this training. And we've found in some of the children who've been released to rural areas with whom we continue to make contact with, it's building a very close partnership with perhaps a teacher at the school, finding the systems that the children do come into contact with, and then helping educate them in ways that will be more effective to the service that they're providing on the ground. And so that's been helpful in what we've been doing.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience?
I have a comment. I just think that the 30-day follow-up is a great program that, there has just recently started.
Wait, just one moment. I want to give you the mic. So sorry.
No, sorry.
Here you go.
I think that the 30-day program, the 30-day follow-up call that was implemented, I think it was sometime last year, has been great, because it allows the facility to contact these minors, and that's when we find out that yes, they do want to return, whether it's unfortunately if there is some trauma or if their reunification is not going well. But it's important to realize that this is the first place for a lot of these children where they've had structure, where they had 3 meals a day, where they've had clothing, where they've had recreational activities, where they were able to actually feel what it's like to be a child. And the relationships that staff create, the bond that they help adjusting to America, the acculturation programs, these simple things as going to the movie theaters, coming out to DC to see the White House and the monuments, taking them to the beach, things that they weren't able to do, unfortunately, because of what happened in home country. I think it would be important, not only with the 30-day follow-up call, but if perhaps there was a type of program where the facility where they came from could kind of have like a mentoring program, a follow-up, because they really do connect with the case managers, with the clinicians, with our residential staff. I just think it would be beneficial because I see it, I hear it in the phone calls. When they say, we miss you, or we miss this, we miss going to school, we miss going to church and things like that. And that's why a lot of the kids, even if they're the shortest amount of stay, you know, the 4 to 7 day kids, they still want to stay with us because they have that freedom and they don't have that connection with their parents, unfortunately, or the people who are the other family members or friends who are taking them in. I feel like I understand there's other resources, but I think that there are different programs for the sponsors, for the parents, to help reconnect, help that bond start or make it stronger for the kids.
Thank you so much for that comment. I believe we're out of time. Thank you so much for attending this panel. I really want to thank Dr. Janell Routh, Marisa Chumil, Takei, and Dr. Jodi Berger Cardoso for their expertise and participation in this panel. I think it was really illuminating. Thanks again, and enjoy your lunch.
I was like,
And Jodi will be
Bye, Jodi.
your guest. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You did a great job. Thank you.
But I really enjoyed participating. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So lunch is right outside in the lobby, in the hallway. And so please enjoy.